Welcome to the Today in History channel. In today's video we will talk about the day, May 24, 1337, beginning of the Hundred Years' War. In 1415, Europe witnessed one of the greatest disasters suffered by the already traditional war weapon of the medieval French, their heavy cavalry. This combat corps, as it was a tradition in medieval society, was made up of elements of the nobility. The melee took place near a village in the north of France, Azincourt. The calculation of forces was absolutely unfavorable to the English, their opponents. Against 7,000 men in England, commanded by their own king, Henry V, 25,000 soldiers were in combat under the command of Charles I of Albret. Enrique V, from England, decided to stay in defense, since he had lower numbers. He ordered the army to place pointed poles in front of their archer positions, so that the cavalry would not hit them. The day was rainy, and the field that the English chose was muddy, making locomotion very difficult. The French general believed that a cavalry charge could destroy the English army, so he sent it, but the mud was preventing a good speed for the horses. English archers began firing and massacred French cavalry before it even reached English positions. French infantry began to advance, but their armor was not strong enough to protect from the arrows launched by the longbows. The French were slaughtered by arrows and mud, as many men were drowned with the weight of their armor. The French even tried to break through enemy lines, but English infantry offered strong resistance. Before long, the French army was retreating. France lost many nobles and important men at Agincourt. Agincourt is not remembered for being a decisive battle, but because it proved that smaller armies can win larger armies, and it also proved that infantry could win the most powerful weapon in medieval battlefields, cavalry. Agincourt, together with Crécy, 1346, and Poitiers, 1356, were some of the great battles fought between the French and English noblemen in the so-called Hundred Years' War, which lasted from 1337 to 1453. In fact, the conflict lasted 116 years, with some intervals of short truces. It was not a question of wars between two countries, two national states, because in fact neither the French or the English state still existed as such. It was a war between noblemen, due to the dispute over the occupation of the French throne. In the medieval period, these dynastic disputes took place due to the control of thrones, lands and titles. With these conditions, it would be possible to collect taxes and continue the nobility maintaining their status. The reason for the Hundred Years' War was the vacancy of the French throne. King Charles IV of France had died in 1328, leaving no heirs. In the French tradition, women did not inherit the throne and, therefore, in the absence of a male heir, the throne was vacant. Edward III, King of England, was the nephew of the deceased king, and since dynastic issues, built on family ties, predominated in the choice of political representatives, he understood himself to be the legitimate heir to the French crown. However, another relative of Charles IV, his cousin Philippe de Valois, also claimed for himself the throne, which he occupied under the name of Philip VI. The scene was set for the longest military feud in the Middle Ages. The war, however, had deeper roots. In the 11th century, the French Duke of Normandy, William the Conqueror, had taken over England, 1066, creating a climate of rivalry between the nobles of France and England. In the 12th century, King Henry II of England had become vassal of the King of France in the duchies of Aquitaine and Gascony by his marriage to Leonor of Aquitaine. By the Treaty of Paris of 1259, King Henry III of England had given up Normandy, Maine, Anjou, Touraine and Poitou, keeping Gascony for himself. The English king therefore had to pay taxes to the French king, while his vassal Gascons complained about English interventions. Another conflict factor was the nervous relations between English and French nobles in the Flanders region, now the Netherlands and Belgium, focusing on commercial relations, since the region was characterized by its rich trade in fabrics produced, in large part, for the wool that came from the English herds. Hostilities began in 1337, in the first phase of the long conflict, which ended in 1340, with the naval Battle of Sluis, won by an Anglo-Flaming coalition, formed in the face of the economic interests that brought together Flanders and the English. The English, commanded by Eduardo III, invaded France, winning important battles like Calais and Crécy. The Black Plague arrived in Europe and added more deaths to those that had already caused the conflict and forced an interruption in the battles. An intricate picture of political relations between the aristocracies of France and England provoked the resumption of fighting in 1364. In the following years the picture would become more complex, since the contenders had their own internal problems, such as the peasants' revolts in the face of the increase from the exploitation that they had been suffering from the nobility, impacted by both war and plague, in addition to the climatic conditions that hindered harvests. The 100 Years' War, with revolts and disruption of harvests, created the picture of the general crisis of the Middle Ages and, therefore, of feudalism. Another character would join the war, Burgundy, which had dynastic pretensions vis-a-vis another part of the French nobility. In this phase, the great advance of King Henry V took place, who managed to reach Paris and married Princess Katerina, daughter of the then Charles VI, King of France, obtaining the right to inherit the French throne. In 1422 both Henry V and Carlos VI died. The successor to the throne was Henry VI, prevented from reigning because he was still a child. Then came the regency, by two English barons, one governing England, Duke of Gloucester, and another, France, Duke of Bedford. France would later be divided into two parts, the north ruled by the King of England, with the support of Burgundy, and the south, now ruled by Charles VII, who had come to the throne. It is in this last phase, started in 1422, that the figure of Joan of Arc appears. Heading a large army, Joanna advanced and achieved the coronation of Charles VII as King of France. In England, there was the so-called War of the Two Roses, among the English nobility, which gave Charles VII time to reorganize and reach Aquitaine in 1453, ending the war with the Battle of Castillon, the last English stronghold in France. Before that final victory, Joan, in 1430, had been captured by the Burgundians, who handed it over to the English at Compiègne. Subjected to an English ecclesiastical court, she was judged as heretical. Joan claimed to have received messages from the Most High and burned alive as a witch in Rouen in 1431. Not exactly the death of Joan of Arc meant a milestone at the turn of the war favor of the French, but also the institution of the hoist, a tax levied in France that made it possible for a more centralized French monarchy to hire mercenaries, some of them Scottish, to fight against the English. Controlling the army and taxes, the French monarchy left for its centralization and the formation of its future absolutist state. The 100 Years' War had shaken French and English feudalism, annihilated much of its nobility, and opened up one of the paths to absolutism. Did you like the video? In the description you will find the blog link with the full article. Give an incentive by subscribing to the channel, liking, commenting, and sharing with your friends. Hugs. Until the next.